Cordelia's phone vibrated once. Only once. But Brianna Holloway saw the way her fingers tightened around the arm of the chair, and she knew, with the same instinct that had kept her alive through 11 years of drifting, that her life had just changed. 30 seconds earlier, she had been reading to her in the sitting room at Ashworth House. October sunlight poured through the tall windows, spilling gold across the hardwood floor. Everything had been peaceful, just like every other afternoon for the past 3 years, ever since the day she arrived with one suitcase and not a single living relative. But Cordelia didn't tell her to keep reading. She told her to put the book down. Then she said, "Someone's coming for you." Cordelia Malone, the woman Brianna had served for 3 years, the woman she had always believed was nothing more than an eccentric, wealthy widow, began to tell the truth. That Brianna's uncle, Douglas Holloway, the man who had stolen her parents' estate and thrown her into the street when she was only 16, had borrowed money from her grandson's organization, $2.7 million. Then he disappeared. And in this world, Cordelia's real world, the world Brianna had spent 3 years pretending not to see, debt ran in the blood. Brianna wasn't entirely shocked. She had seen Oscar, Cordelia's bodyguard, carrying a gun beneath his suit jacket. She had seen men arrive at midnight and vanish before dawn. She had chosen not to ask questions, because Ashworth House was the only place in this world that had taken her in. But now, that door was closing. "My grandson will be here tonight," Cordelia said. Rafferty Malone. Brianna knew that name, not from Cordelia, but from newspaper headlines no one ever dared to write in full, from conversations people lowered their voices to have. They called him the gentleman, the boss who controlled the entire underground network of the Northeast, the man who wore a 3-piece suit, even when he was giving the order to destroy someone, and he was coming for her. Cordelia looked at Brianna with those sharp black eyes. "Put on the blue dress I gave you. When my grandson walks in, you need to look like you belong to this house, not like prey." Brianna wanted to run, but she had no money, no family, no place in the world where the underworld wouldn't find her. She changed into the dress with trembling hands. Then, the security camera at the front gate lit up. A line of black SUVs rolled slowly through the gravel drive, steady and certain, like something that couldn't be stopped. Cordelia rose to her feet, leaning on her cane, her posture commanding and unyielding. "Remember what I told you? Don't bow your head, don't apologize, and don't ever let him see that you're afraid." Brianna Holloway had no way of knowing that the next 7 days would change everything, that the mafia boss who stepped through those gates would look at her with a cold, steely gaze, and then never be able to stop looking, that she would be forced to choose between freedom and love with the most dangerous man she had ever known. But it all began with a phone call, one vibration, and a debt she had never borrowed. If you'd like to know what happens when Brianna comes face to face with the gentleman, please hit like to support the channel. Share this video with someone who loves dramatic stories too. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the bell so you won't miss the next chapter. The great doors of Ashworth House opened without a knock. Brianna stood behind Cordelia, her fingers laced so tightly behind her back they almost hurt, fighting to keep her breathing even. She had spent the last 3 hours bracing herself, ever since Cordelia had told her the truth. But nothing could have prepared her for the moment Rafferty Malone stepped across the threshold. He was taller than she had imagined. His broad shoulders nearly filled the doorway. His black 3-piece suit fitted to his body like armor tailored by hand. His dark hair swept back so perfectly not a single strand had fallen out of place. But what stole Brianna's breath wasn't his size. It was his eyes. His piercing stare was as cold and sharp as a freshly honed blade. They swept across the grand hall in less than 2 seconds, taking in everything. The position of every servant, the angle of every camera, the distance to the door, and then came to rest on Cordelia. He walked forward, removing his leather gloves with 2 precise movements, as if he had done it 10,000 times before, and placed them into Oscar's waiting hand behind him, without even turning around. Then he bent and kissed his grandmother's cheek. "You called. I came." His voice was low, polished, courteous, but Brianna could hear what lay underneath that courtesy, the absolute control of a man who never allowed himself to lose composure. Cordelia lifted a hand to his cheek and smiled. "You look tired." "I look busy," he corrected. Then his gaze shifted to the right, and stopped on Brianna. She felt that look like a physical touch, heavy, cold, pressing against her skin. He didn't look at her the way one person looks at another. He looked at her the way a man studies a piece he hasn't yet decided where to place in the larger picture. "Who is this?" 2 words, not rude, but not for a second suggesting she was important enough to be asked directly. He asked Cordelia, not her. Cordelia answered in an even voice. "Brianna Holloway, the one who's cared for me these past 3 years, and also Douglas Holloway's niece." The air in the hall changed at once. Brianna saw it happen, the way Oscar leaned ever so slightly forward behind him, the way the 2 bodyguards by the door lowered their hands, the way Raph's jaw tightened beneath his skin. He looked at her again. This time, everything was different. She was no longer an unplaced piece. She had become the target. "Douglas Holloway owes me $2.7 million. His voice was still low, still courteous, but the temperature in the room seemed to drop. "He disappeared 3 months ago, without a trace. And you?" He tipped his head just slightly. "You're here." Brianna swallowed. Her throat had gone dry, but she wouldn't allow herself to look down. Cordelia's words rang through her mind. "Don't bow your head. Don't apologize. Don't let him see you're afraid. I have nothing to do with my uncle." Her voice came out smaller than she wanted, but it didn't shake. "I haven't seen him since I was 16. He took everything my parents had and threw me into the street. I don't know where he is. I don't want to know." Raph didn't react. He didn't nod, didn't frown, didn't shift his expression at all. He only looked at her, and Brianna had the strange feeling that he was reading every word she spoke, not with his ears, but with something deeper, the instinct of a man who had heard thousands of lies and somehow learned to recognize the truth in a way she couldn't understand. "In my world," he said slowly, "that doesn't matter. Debt runs in the blood. You're Douglas's blood. You're here. That's all I need." Brianna felt the floor tilt beneath her feet. He didn't say she was guilty. He said she was present. And in his world, those 2 things weren't different. "You'll stay," Raph said, and it wasn't an offer. It was a verdict. "Until Douglas shows himself. You're the only thing that might draw him out of hiding." Prey. She was prey. Brianna opened her mouth to say something, anything at all, but Cordelia cut across the moment. Her voice rang out, clear and commanding, carrying a force that made even Rafferty Malone stop. "Sit down, both of you. I'm not finished speaking." Cordelia didn't sit down. She remained standing, leaning on her cane, her spine rigid with a lifetime of authority, looking at both of them with unblinking black eyes. Raph had taken the armchair to the right of the fireplace, not because she told him to, but because he wanted to hear the rest and bring this whole matter to an end. Brianna sat across from him, her back not quite touching the chair, her hands resting on her lap, her fingers locked together so tightly her knuckles had gone white. She could still feel the weight of Raph's unblinking, iron-colored gaze at the edge of her vision, heavy as something physical. But she didn't turn toward him. She kept her eyes on Cordelia. Cordelia was the only person in the room she trusted, though now she wasn't sure how far that trust ought to go. "There's something you don't know, Rafferty." Cordelia spoke in the same calm voice one might use to discuss the weather. "Your grandfather's will." Raph tilted his head slightly. That was the only reaction he allowed himself. "I know the will." "You know the part Patrick wanted you to know," she answered. "There's an additional clause. His lawyer kept it sealed at my request, until I decided to reveal it. And I've decided today." She moved slowly toward the window, the light throwing the long shadow of her cane across the hardwood floor. "The entirety of the Malone family's legal holdings, the real estate, the public shares, the declared accounts, may pass to you only if you marry before the age of 37. Silence. Brianna saw Raph's fingers tighten on the arm of the chair, slow and controlled, but tightening all the same. "You have less than a year left," Cordelia went on. "If you don't, everything passes to the second line of inheritance, the Caruso family." The name landed in the room like a bullet. Brianna didn't know much about the Carusos, but she knew enough from 3 years of overhearing conversations she was never meant to hear. Caruso was the enemy. Caruso was the reason Raph's father was in the ground. Raph stood up, slowly, with control, but Brianna could see his jaw harden like stone. "How long have you kept this from me?" "Since the day your grandfather died. 14 years. His voice was still low, still polished, but beneath that polished restraint, Brianna heard something splitting open. "And you choose today to tell me. Because today, I have a solution." Cordelia turned, and looked at Brianna. Brianna felt that look like a laser, precise and purposeful, and she understood before Cordelia even spoke. Her stomach tightened. "Marry Brianna," she said. No softening, no preamble. The 2 words dropped into the center of the room. A marriage in name only, a clear contract. Brianna is released from Douglas's debt and placed under protection. You keep the legal holdings. After 1 year, a clean divorce. No one loses anything. Raph turned and looked at Brianna. This time, she looked back. Those stormy orbs were no longer cold. They were burning, with anger, with disbelief, and with something dangerously close to betrayal. "You want me to marry your servant?" he said, his voice so low Brianna almost had to lean forward to hear it, to keep a few buildings. Brianna spoke before she had time to think. "I don't agree." Both Raph and Cordelia turned to look at her. "I'm not for sale," she said. Her voice trembled slightly at the end, but she didn't let it tremble any further. "Not for money, not for debt, not for any contract." Cordelia looked at her for a long moment. Not angry, not disappointed. Something like satisfaction passed briefly through her eyes, as though Brianna's answer was exactly what she had hoped to hear. "You're not selling yourself," she said gently. "You're buying your freedom. That's entirely different." Then she turned to Raph. Her voice changed, softer, but heavier, carrying something Brianna had never heard from her before, the fatigue of someone who had lost too much. "Your father died protecting this family. Declan died on his own kitchen floor to preserve everything Patrick built. And now you would let all of it fall into Caruso hands because of your pride?" The room went still. Brianna looked at Raph. She saw something crack in his eyes, fast and deep, and then vanish beneath the surface at once, but she had seen it. The name Declan had done what no one else in that room could do. It had silenced Rafferty Malone. He didn't sit down. He stood by the fireplace, one hand braced against the marble mantel, his eyes fixed on the flames. The silence stretched so long, Brianna could hear the wall clock marking each passing second. Then Cordelia stepped closer, laid her hand on his arm, and spoke in a voice Brianna understood wasn't the voice of a matriarch, but the voice of a grandmother. 1 week. Give me 1 week." Raph didn't say yes. He didn't say no either. He looked at Cordelia for a long, long moment, then gently but firmly removed her hand from his arm. 1 week, he said, "to verify that she has nothing to do with Douglas, and to consider it, but don't mistake that for agreement." Cordelia nodded, slow and satisfied, like someone who had already seen the next move before her opponent ever lifted the piece. 1 week is enough. She turned to Brianna. "You're staying too. This isn't a question." Brianna wanted to say something, wanted to say that she wasn't a chess piece, that no one had the right to decide whether she stayed or went, but she looked into Cordelia's eyes and saw what she had seen for 3 years, hardness wrapped around something that looked a great deal like care. Cordelia wasn't forcing her out of cruelty. She was forcing her because she believed this was the only way to keep everyone safe. Brianna nodded, said nothing. Cordelia struck her cane once against the floor, sharp and final, like the sound of a gavel ending a trial. Then it settled. "Everyone get some rest. Tomorrow, we begin." She turned and walked toward her private rooms. Oscar opened the door for her, then disappeared after her. The 2 bodyguards withdrew toward the front entrance. The servants faded back into shadow. Within seconds, the great hall stood nearly empty, leaving only Brianna and Raph. She turned to go to her room, but his voice stopped her. "Miss Holloway." She froze, didn't turn around. "I don't trust you." There was no anger in his voice, no coldness, just the truth, spoken in the voice of a man who had lived by suspicion his entire life and had no intention of changing now. Brianna turned back. The light from the corridor cast both of their shadows against the opposite wall, long and distorted. She looked into his gray eyes. They weren't as cold as they had been when he first walked in. They looked tired and wary, like her own eyes every morning in the mirror for the past 11 years. "I don't trust you either," she answered. Not a challenge, not fear, just her truth, set beside his. Raph looked at her for another few seconds. She didn't know what he was searching for in her face, a lie, weakness, or something else entirely. But whatever it was, he didn't find it, because he gave the slightest tilt of his head, so faint it was almost invisible, then turned and walked away toward the west wing. His footsteps on the hardwood floor were steady and sure, until they disappeared beyond the bend in the corridor. Brianna stood alone in the hallway. Her heart was beating faster than usual, but she didn't run. She climbed the stairs slowly, past the second floor where the guest rooms still glowed with lamplight, past the third floor where the lights in Cordelia's rooms had already gone dark, and up to the attic level where her room sat at the end of a narrow hall. It was a small room, with a ceiling sloping under the roofline, one window overlooking the front grounds, a single bed, a wooden wardrobe, and a bookshelf Cordelia had allowed her to fill herself. This was where Brianna had lived for 3 years. Longer than anywhere else since the day her parents died. She closed the door, slid the bolt, leaned her back against the wood, and trembled. Not trembling because she was afraid of Rafferty Malone. She had survived winters in Hunts Point. She had slept in shelters where you had to hide your shoes beneath your pillow so they wouldn't be stolen. She had worked night shifts in bars where men looked at her the way they looked at objects. She knew what fear was. This wasn't fear. This was something else. Something she had no name for. When Raph had looked at her in the hall, when he had said, "Debt runs in the blood. You're here." When his gaze moved over her as though reading a page from a file, she had felt something she hadn't felt in a very, very long time. Seen. Not looked past. Not looked down on. Not looked through as though she were air. But seen. Directly. Fully. Without turning away. 11 years. 11 years of living like a ghost among the living. And tonight, for the first time, someone had looked straight at her, and that someone was the most dangerous man she had ever met. Brianna noticed the new camera before she noticed the sun had risen. She woke at 5 o'clock in the morning, just as she did every day, opened the door to her attic room, and her eyes stopped on the right-hand corner of the hallway ceiling, a small black device, mounted to the wooden frame with a metal bracket still bright and new, untouched by dust. It hadn't been there last night. Her visual memory confirmed it at once. She knew exactly how that corner of the ceiling had looked every morning for 3 years, and today it was different. She didn't break stride. She didn't look up. She didn't let the slightest sign show that she had seen it. She simply walked on, down the stairs, through the second-floor corridor, and toward Cordelia's room. Along the way, she counted 2 more cameras, one at the head of the stairs, one in the corner of the hallway leading to the great sitting room. Rafferty Malone didn't trust her, and he was proving it through a lens. Brianna wasn't angry. She understood. If she had been in his position, she would have done the same. In the world she had grown up in shelters, in late-night bars, in jobs where employers looked at her like something replaceable, she had learned one thing: when someone doesn't trust you, don't try to convince them. Just live the way you've always lived. The truth doesn't need a defense. So she lived as usual. She helped Cordelia into her morning robe. She made the tea exactly the way Cordelia liked it. Earl Grey, no sugar, hot milk served separately. She wrote letters as Cordelia dictated, her handwriting neat and steady. She read to her after lunch. She walked with her in the garden that afternoon, supporting her over the uneven gravel. She did everything exactly as she did every other day, because every other day was the truth of her life. Meanwhile, downstairs, in the study Brianna wasn't allowed to enter, Raph was reading her life on paper. Oscar laid the file on the oak desk at 7 o'clock that morning. It wasn't thick. Brianna Holloway's life wasn't complicated enough to make a thick file. Raph turned each page. Gelding. Her parents had died in a house fire when she was 16. Her uncle, Douglas Holloway, had been appointed her guardian, sold the house, sold the car, emptied the savings account, then surrendered guardianship 6 months later. Brianna entered the New York City shelter system. After that came 14 jobs in 8 years, washing dishes in Queens, cleaning motel rooms in Jersey City, waitressing in a late-night bar in Brooklyn, working as a cashier in a convenience store in the Bronx, and 10 other jobs, even shorter, even more temporary, leaving behind no trace except a few lines in her federal tax record. No meaningful bank account, no property, no car, no passport. Not a single incoming or outgoing call tied to any number connected to Douglas Holloway in the past 5 years. No contact with anyone except Cordelia Malone. Oscar stood silently by the desk while Raph read. When Raph closed the file, Oscar spoke in his usual level voice, stripped of emotion, though Brianna would never know that beneath that even tone was something dangerously close to pity. Clean. So clean it's almost pitiful. Raph didn't comment. He set the file aside, opened his laptop, and went back to work. But Oscar noticed, because Oscar noticed everything, that Raph didn't move on to the next matter right away. He sat still for a few seconds, his eyes resting on the last page of the file, the one listing the address of the final shelter Brianna had stayed in before coming to Ashworth House. Hunts Point, Bronx. Raph knew that neighborhood. That afternoon, when Brianna brought Cordelia back to her room after their walk, she passed the door to Raph's study. The door stood open by only a few inches. She didn't stop. She didn't tilt her head. But her ears sharpened by 11 years of listening for footsteps in shelter hallways, so she'd know who was coming and whether she ought to pretend to be asleep, caught Raph's voice through the narrow opening. Low, clear, cold. Still no sign of Holloway. Widen the scope. Check every financial contact from the past 5 years. I want to know where he is before the weekend. Brianna kept walking. Her feet didn't stop. Her face didn't change. But inside her chest, something turned to ice. Douglas was still being hunted. The hunt hadn't stopped because she was here. Her being here was part of the hunt. Cordelia had said, freedom. Raph had said, 1 week. But Brianna was beginning to understand the truth that lived between those two promises. The debt wasn't finished. Douglas hadn't been found. And in this house, she wasn't a guest. She was a hostage with an expiration date. On the morning of the second day, Cordelia called Brianna into her private room before breakfast. She was seated in her black velvet chair, her tea untouched, her eyes as sharp as ever. You'll have breakfast with my grandson. Brianna paused in the middle of sorting the letters. Ma'am, I don't think that's a good idea. I didn't ask what you think. I told you what you'll do. Her voice didn't rise. It wasn't harsh, but it carried the kind of authority that didn't need volume to make people obey. Brianna nodded. She walked toward the large dining room with slow steps, wishing the hallway were longer. Raph was already there. He stood beside the tall window overlooking the garden, his back turned to her. Morning sunlight poured through the glass and fell across the shoulders of his white shirt. No suit jacket today. His sleeves rolled to the elbows. When she entered, he turned around, not angry, not cold. Just something Brianna couldn't read, and that unsettled her more than the coldness had. He pulled out a chair for her. She sat. The table was long, the distance between them wide enough to seat 3 more people. The soft touch of silverware against china. Birds in the garden beyond the window. Silence stretched long enough for Brianna to count her own breathing. Then Raph spoke. Your file says you stayed in 5 different shelters. Brianna set down her fork. He had read the file. Of course he had. Yes. Which one was the worst? It didn't sound like an interrogation. His voice was different, lower, slower, as though he were asking because he truly wanted to know, not because he meant to add it to a report. Brianna looked at him. His gray eyes met hers and waited. Hunts Point, she answered. The Bronx. Winter of 2019. She saw his jaw tighten just slightly. Only slightly, but she saw it. The shelter on Garrison Street, she went on. Not enough beds. The heat was broken for 2 weeks in January. Snow came through the cracks in the window frame. I slept in 3 layers and kept my shoes in a plastic bag under my pillow, because if I left them on the floor, they would have been gone by morning. She said it in an even voice, without complaint, without self-pity, only the truth, as if she were describing yesterday's weather. Raph was silent. Brianna knew he knew Hunts Point, not from maps or news reports. His empire controlled part of that neighborhood. The streets freight trucks passed through at midnight. The buildings where cash moved faster than water through a drain. He knew what the winter of 2019 had been there. 15 below, 3 people frozen to death in 2 weeks, the police not bothering to come. And the woman sitting across from him had lived through that winter. For the first time since entering Ashworth House, Raph looked at Brianna without searching for signs of deception. He looked at her the way a man looks at someone who has crossed a battlefield and lived. Not pity. Something deeper. Closer. Something Brianna didn't dare name. Breakfast ended in silence after that. No one said another word. But this silence was different from the silence the day before. It wasn't heavy. It was only still. At noon, when Brianna was walking from Cordelia's room back toward her own, she passed Oscar in the second-floor hallway. On every other day, Oscar looked straight through her as though she were part of the wall. Today, he stopped, tilted his head slightly, nodded. A small nod, quick, almost impossible to notice. But Brianna noticed. She noticed everything. In Oscar's world, where trust was measured in decades rather than words. A nod offered to an outsider was practically a declaration. She nodded back. No smile, no words, just a nod. Oscar kept walking. That afternoon, in the study, Oscar stood beside Raf's desk as he always did. Raf was reviewing footage from the hallway cameras. On the screen, Brianna moved past 3 cameras without once looking up, without once changing her pace, without once letting it show that she knew she was being watched. But she knew. Raf knew she knew, because no one moved that naturally under a lens unless they had already noticed it and chosen not to react. She sees everything, Oscar said, his tone as even as if he were commenting on the weather. The new cameras, she knew on the first morning, didn't look up, didn't change her route, but she knew. Raf didn't lift his eyes from the screen. And? She's like you, Oscar said. Raf's hand stopped on the keyboard. He didn't like the comparison, but he didn't deny it. On the 3rd day, Brianna began to see Rafferty Malone through the things he didn't say. That morning, she took Cordelia for her usual walk through the garden. From the southern gravel path, she saw Raf speaking with the estate manager near the carriage house. He called the man by his name, Warren, not the manager or my employee, Warren. She heard him ask about the man's family, about the daughter away at college, and there was nothing polite and empty in his voice. He was truly listening to the answer. When Warren mentioned the winter wages for the grounds crew, Raf nodded and said something brief that Brianna was standing too far away to catch. But Warren's face as he walked away said everything. Relief, gratitude. At noon, she happened to see the payroll ledger on Cordelia's desk while sorting the day's correspondence. The pay for each employee on the estate was noticeably higher than average. She didn't comment. She simply noted it. Rafferty Malone gave orders to kill in a courteous voice, yet he paid his workers above market and remembered the estate manager's daughter's name. She didn't know how to place those two truths inside the same man. And Raf was watching her too. He didn't say it, but Brianna felt it. She noticed it in the way he sometimes slowed when passing her in the hallway, half a step off his normal pace. She noticed it when he stopped asking Oscar about her every night, because Oscar told her after the second nod they exchanged in the corridor, "He doesn't need me to report on you anymore. He's watching for himself." That afternoon, a black sedan pulled up at the gate. A silver-haired man stepped out, wearing a dark coat and the white collar of a priest. Father Donovan. Brianna knew him. He visited Cordelia once a month, drank tea, made small talk, then left. Cordelia had always said he was an old friend, but today he hadn't come to see Cordelia. He had come to see Brianna. She was sitting on the stone bench in the garden, a book open on her lap, though her eyes weren't truly reading. When Donovan sat down beside her, let out a soft breath, and looked across the garden dressed in autumn colors. "Do you know what you're walking into?" he asked, with no attempt to soften it. Brianna answered with the truth. "I'm not walking into it. I'm being pulled into it." Donovan nodded slowly, as if that answer confirmed what he had already suspected. "Rafferty isn't a monster," he said. "I've known him since he was 8 years old, standing beside his father's coffin, without shedding a single tear, because he had already decided that crying was weakness, and weakness meant death. He isn't evil, but he lives among monsters, and when you live among monsters long enough, the line between man and monster begins to blur." He fell silent for a moment. The wind moved through the garden, stirring the branches of the maples now burning red. "His father, Declan, loved a good woman too," Donovan went on. "An ordinary girl, someone who didn't belong to that world. She loved Declan with her whole heart, and she had to bury him before she was 30. Brianna said nothing. She looked down at the book in her lap, but she didn't see the words. She saw a white-tiled floor she had never laid eyes on, and yet somehow could imagine clearly, blood on white tile, an 8-year-old boy standing there watching. Donovan laid a hand on her shoulder, light and brief, then stood. "I'm not telling you this to frighten you. I'm telling you so you'll open your eyes before your heart opens." He went inside the house. Brianna remained in the garden until the light was gone. That night, when Brianna carried tea into Cordelia's room, Cordelia looked at her with those black eyes that missed nothing. "You're quieter than usual." "I'm thinking more than usual," Brianna answered. Cordelia took a sip of tea, set the cup down, then said it as casually as if she were commenting on the weather. "He had the attic cameras removed yesterday morning. Didn't you notice?" Brianna had noticed. That morning she had seen the old drill marks in the ceiling where the camera had been mounted. Nothing left now but an empty hole. She chose not to say so. Rafferty doesn't remove cameras for just anyone, Cordelia continued. He doesn't do that for people he doesn't care about. Brianna didn't answer. She lowered her head, gathered the tea tray, and left the room. But when she reached the attic level, she didn't go straight inside. She stopped by the window at the end of the hall, the one that looked out over the front lawn. Night had already fallen. A thin mist lay over the grass. And below, standing alone in the dark, was Raph. No Oscar at his side, no phone in his hand, no suit jacket, only a white shirt turned silver under the moonlight. He stood there with his face lifted toward the sky, in complete silence, looking like a man trying to breathe in a world that didn't hold enough air. Brianna watched him for a long moment, and she recognized something in him that she knew better than almost anyone. Loneliness. Not the kind that comes from having no one beside you. The kind that has lived in your bones for so long it becomes part of your body. So long you forget what the feeling is called. So long you start to think you're fine because you no longer feel anything at all. She knew that kind of loneliness. She had lived with it for 11 years. On the night of the 4th day, Brianna couldn't sleep. She lay on the bed in her attic room, eyes open, staring at the sloped ceiling above her. The old drill hole where the camera had once been mounted sat directly over her head, dark and empty. She thought about Donovan, about the white-tiled floor, about Raph standing alone in the yard the night before. Then she heard voices. The old ventilation shafts of Ashworth House ran through the walls from the attic all the way down to the 1st floor. A system from the days before the house had modern air conditioning. Cordelia had once explained that they no longer worked, but Brianna knew they still carried sound. 3 years of sleeping in that room had taught her every echo that traveled through those vents. Cordelia's soft nighttime cough, Oscar's early morning reports over the phone, the footsteps of maids cleaning the rooms below. She knew every voice in this house, and the voice drifting up through the vent now didn't belong to anyone she knew. Low, slightly rough, speaking English in a slow, controlled rhythm. Raph's voice cut in, then another voice she recognized as the lieutenant in charge of the docks. They were in a meeting. The study on the 1st floor, directly beneath her room. Brianna lay still and listened, not out of curiosity, but out of instinct. The instinct that had kept her alive through 11 years had not gone quiet just because she was lying in a soft bed inside a mansion. It was always awake, always scanning, always taking note, and right now, it was screaming. That unfamiliar voice. She knew it. Her visual memory flipped back to 2 days earlier, that afternoon when she had taken Cordelia for a walk in the garden. A small delivery truck had been parked at the side gate, the logo of a wine supplier painted on the side. A middle-aged man stepped down, salt and pepper hair, pale blue shirt. One of the maids had led him in through the kitchen entrance. Brianna had seen him crossing the courtyard while she sat on the stone bench with a book in her lap, and she had known even then, though she hadn't said a word to anyone, that something was wrong. He had moved off course. The kitchen door was on the west side, but he had circled east first, along the outer passage that connected to the study and the meeting room. He had stopped for nearly 20 seconds at the corner where the main security camera faced the front grounds, his eyes not on the direction signs, but lifted upward, flicking quickly, counting cameras, marking angles. Then he had gone on into the kitchen as if nothing had happened. Brianna remembered his face now. Then she matched that face to the voice rising through the vent. It fit. The same man. The wine supplier from 2 days ago was now sitting in a meeting room with Raph and his lieutenants. Her heart began to pound. She sat up, her feet touching the cold floor. Thought. Didn't panic. Thought. A wine supplier had no reason to be sitting in a late-night meeting with a mafia boss. An ordinary man didn't count cameras while making a delivery. A harmless man didn't drift off his route to scout the corridor outside the study. She stood, opened her door without a sound, moved quickly down the stairs, barefoot on the cold wood, avoiding the 7th step because it creaked, down past the 2nd floor, then the 1st, into the hallway leading to the meeting room. Oscar stood outside the door, back against the wall, arms crossed over his chest. He saw Brianna coming and frowned, already preparing to stop her. But Brianna spoke first. Fast, low, exact. The man in the meeting room. He came here 2 days ago pretending to be a wine supplier. He didn't go straight into the kitchen. He went around through the east corridor first. He stopped for 20 seconds at the main camera corner. His eyes weren't on the signs. He was looking up, counting cameras, marking the angles. He's not a supplier, and he shouldn't be in that room. Oscar looked at her. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3. His eyes didn't blink, his face didn't change, but Brianna saw the muscles in his shoulders tighten beneath his suit jacket, saw his right hand lower toward his side, where she knew the gun rested. Then he nodded once, short and decisive. He turned, opened the meeting room door, and stepped inside. 30 seconds later, the sound of a chair crashing to the floor exploded into the hallway. Everything happened fast. From outside the meeting room door, Brianna heard Oscar's voice cut sharply across the conversation, brief and precise. Then another chair crashed over, a short burst of struggle, the sound of metal striking metal, and the muffled, choking groan of a man being forced down to the floor. Then silence, the kind of silence heavier than noise. The meeting room door opened. 2 lieutenants came out first, their faces tight, not looking at Brianna as they headed straight for the back exit. Then Oscar emerged, dragging the salt and pepper-haired man behind him. The man's hands were bound behind his back with plastic ties, his mouth gagged with a strip of cloth, his eyes wild as they darted up and down the hallway. As he passed Brianna, she saw what Oscar had found on him. A small pistol, its magazine removed, lay in the hand of the lieutenant behind them, and a fingertip-sized recording device, hidden inside the lining of the man's vest, now sat inside a clear plastic evidence bag in Oscar's left hand. A spy. Caruso family. Brianna stood flat against the wall, still, silent, barely breathing, watching them pass as if she were part of the stone itself. Then Raph stepped out of the meeting room. He stopped when he saw her. His face was pale, not pale with fear, pale with anger. The cold, controlled kind of anger more dangerous than any open fury. He had just come within inches of having the entire strategy meeting in his own house recorded. Or worse, the gun hidden in that man's vest lining hadn't been there for decoration. Raph looked at Brianna. She looked back. She didn't lower her head. She didn't look away. "You saw what my entire security team missed," he said. His voice was low and controlled, but Brianna could hear what lay beneath it. The shock of a man who had just realized the greatest weakness in his defenses wasn't technology or personnel, but complacency. "I'm used to noticing things," she answered, her voice even. "When you've lived in dangerous places long enough, you learn to spot a threat before it arrives." Raph was silent, looking at her, for a long moment. Then he said 2 words Brianna had never heard him say to anyone since she first stepped inside Ashworth House. "Thank you." Those 2 words fell into the dark hallway like a pebble dropped into still water, small, but sending out ripples that wouldn't stop. Brianna nodded, said nothing more. Raph turned away and moved quickly toward the east wing, where Oscar had taken the spy. Brianna remained in the hall, her heart still beating hard, telling herself she ought to go back upstairs, ought to go to sleep, ought to pretend nothing had happened tonight, and make Cordelia's tea in the morning, as always. But her feet didn't take her upstairs. They carried her toward the east wing, not out of curiosity, because the instinct that had screamed at her the moment she heard that strange voice through the old vent still hadn't gone quiet. It was telling her the night wasn't over, that she needed to know, needed to see. The east wing corridor was long and darker than the rest of the house. Only 1 lamp burned at the far end, spilling a pale yellow glow against the stone wall. The last door stood slightly open. Not much, only a few inches. Enough for Brianna, as she passed, to see inside. Raph was seated in a wooden chair across from the spy. His suit was still immaculate. His back was straight. 1 leg crossed over the other. His hands rested on his lap, fingers woven together, perfectly calm. He was speaking to the spy in a courteous voice, the same voice he had used when asking Warren about his daughter, the same voice he had used when he thanked her minutes earlier. But his eyes were different. Through the crack in the door, Brianna looked into Raph's eyes and saw something that turned her blood cold. Emptiness. Absolute emptiness. No anger, no hatred, no mercy, no feeling at all. It was like looking into the eyes of a statue, the man she had seen give the faintest smile across the breakfast table, the man who had gone still when Cordelia spoke Declan's name, the man who had stood alone under the night sky in the yard. That man was gone. The one sitting in that room was someone else entirely. Raph asked the spy a question. His voice was even gentle, as if he were asking whether someone preferred tea or coffee. The spy didn't answer. Raph didn't repeat himself. He only gave the smallest nod toward Oscar, who stood at his side, Oscar stepped forward. Brianna stepped back. Her feet moved out of the strip of light spilling through the doorway, her back touching the cold hall wall. She didn't see what happened next, but she heard it. She heard a chair scrape across the wooden floor. The sound of fabric tearing, a noise she didn't want to name, then the muffled groan of pain behind the cloth gag, then Raph's voice, still polite, still soft, asking the same question again. Brianna stood there in the dark hallway with her back against the cold stone and understood. Courtesy and mercy, two words she had once thought belonged together. But in Rafferty Malone's world, they were two entirely different things. Brianna returned to her attic room with quicker steps than the ones that had carried her there. She closed the door, slid the bolt into place, and sat down on the edge of the bed. Her hands rested on her thighs, palms turned upward, as if she were checking to see whether they still belonged to her. She wasn't shaking. She should have been shaking. She had just stood outside a door and listened to a man being questioned by methods she didn't want to imagine, and she wasn't shaking. That made her feel sicker than the sounds from the East Wing ever had. She lay down, pulled the blanket to her chest, and closed her eyes. But her eyes wouldn't stay closed. The dark ceiling stared back at her, the empty drill hole where the camera had once been mounted like a blind eye, and she saw Raph's face again through the crack in the door. Empty eyes, courteous voice, that small nod toward Oscar before everything began. Father Donovan's words echoed in her mind. So clearly it felt as though he were sitting beside her bed. When you live among monsters long enough, the line between man and monster begins to blur. Brianna opened her eyes, stared at the ceiling, and wondered, am I falling in love with the man I should be afraid of? The word love touched her consciousness like a finger pressed against a burn, sudden, painful, and impossible to pull away from. She didn't know when it had begun. Was it when he pulled out her chair at breakfast? When he asked, which place was the worst? In a voice that truly wanted to know. When he stood alone in the yard beneath the darkness, looking like a man carrying the weight of the whole world without ever being allowed to set it down? Or had it started long before that, 3 years earlier? When he walked past her in the hallway without a glance, and she hated the way her heart still beat faster even though he didn't know she existed. She didn't know. She only knew that tonight she had seen two faces of the same man, and both of them were real. Raph remembered the estate manager's daughter's name. Raph gave Oscar the nod to torture a man with a courteous voice. Both were him. And she, Brianna Holloway, the girl who had once slept clutching her shoes in a Hunts Point shelter, was now lying in bed asking herself whether she could live with both of those faces. The sound of an engine drifted up from the yard. Brianna looked at the clock on the wall. 3 a.m. She sat up, crossed to the window, and looked down. A black SUV was backing out through the side gate, its headlights off, only the faint red pulse of the taillights flashing before it disappeared into the darkness of the road leading off the estate. She didn't know who was inside the vehicle. She didn't need to know. She knew enough. Handling it in Rafferty Malone's world didn't mean calling the police. It meant a vehicle at 3 a.m, headlights dark, driving toward a place no one would ever ask about. Brianna returned to the bed. She didn't lie down. She sat with her back against the wall, the blanket wrapped around her shoulders, her eyes fixed on the door, waiting. She didn't know for what. 4 a.m, a knock at the door, soft, 2 knocks, slow, not a servant's knock, not Oscar. Brianna knew who was standing outside before she opened it. She knew because her heart had begun beating in that different rhythm, the one she had spent 4 days trying to ignore. She opened the door. Raph stood there. His suit jacket was gone. His tie hung loose and crooked against his wrinkled shirt. His eyes looked exhausted, the dark circles beneath them heavier than she had ever seen. And he looked like a man who had lived 3 days inside a single night. And on the right sleeve of his shirt, from wrist almost to elbow, there was a dark red stain. Not large, but enough to see, enough to understand. Brianna looked at it. Her gaze rested on that red mark for exactly 2 seconds. Then she looked up at his face. Raph saw her see it. He knew she had noticed. She knew he knew. Neither of them said a word about it. Not one. The red stain on his sleeve lay between them like a piece of evidence both the prosecution and the defense had chosen not to mention. Brianna, I owe you more than a thank you, Raph said. His voice was rougher than usual, worn down by the length of the night. You don't owe me anything, Brianna answered. You're wrong, he said softly. Silence. The clock on her wall ticked. The night wind pressed gently against the attic window. I've been blind for 3 years, Raph said. You were in my house. You walked past me every day. And I never saw you. Not once. He paused. His gray eyes held hers. Not cold, not empty the way they had been in the East Wing, but open, exhausted, and so real that Brianna had to bite the inside of her lip to keep her face still. Now I do, he said. 3 words. Heavier than $2.7 million. Heavier than the will. Heavier than the sound of the vehicle at 3 a.m. Brianna didn't answer. She didn't know how to answer. Raph gave the slightest nod, as if her silence was enough. Then he turned away and went down the stairs, his footsteps fading into the dark. Brianna closed the door, slid the bolt back into place, leaned her back against the wood, looked down at her own hands. Her hands weren't shaking, and that frightened her more than anything else she had heard that night, because it meant she was getting used to it. On the morning of the 5th day, Brianna walked into the dining room and realized something had changed. Not the room, not the light. Raph. He was already seated at the table, but today he wasn't standing by the window with his back to her the way he had every other morning. He was sitting closer, in the chair nearest the one she would take, with only a single empty seat between them instead of 3. On the table, beside the cup of coffee he was drinking, sat a second cup already poured, Earl Grey. No sugar. Hot milk in a small pitcher on the side, exactly the way she drank it, exactly the way she made it for Cordelia every morning and for herself every night. Brianna looked at the tea, then at Raph. He didn't explain. He didn't say, I noticed what you drink. He only nudged the plate of pastries toward her and said, Sit. 1 word, but the tone was different, not the command of a man used to being obeyed, the invitation of a man who had thought of her before she walked into the room. She sat down, and for the first time in 5 days, breakfast didn't begin in silence. Raph asked a question, not the kind that belonged in a file. Not, where have you been? What did you do? How long? A different kind. Which job did you like best? Brianna thought for a moment. Cashier at a convenience store on Grand Concourse. The Bronx. Morning shift. Why? Because the owner was Korean. He didn't talk much, but every morning he left a lunchbox aside for me. He never asked if I was hungry. He just left it there. That was the first place where someone gave me something without wanting anything back. Raph listened. He didn't nod automatically. He didn't say, I understand, because he was intelligent enough to know he didn't. He had never slept with his shoes under his pillow in a shelter, but he listened with his full attention, eyes never leaving her, his body turned toward her, as if everything else in the room had ceased to exist. Brianna told him more then. Small pieces, carefully, like opening a hand that had been clenched for 11 years and offering up, one by one, the stones she had hidden inside, each one a piece of memory she had never given to anyone. The dishwashing job in Queens, where she learned that if she stood in just the right corner of the kitchen, the heat from the industrial washer was enough to warm her through the whole night shift. The motel in Jersey City where she cleaned rooms and found a book someone had left behind. The first book she had read after leaving school, the one that taught her the world inside books, was larger than the world she was living in. The late-night bar in Brooklyn where she learned to read people, to know who was drunk but harmless, who was sober and dangerous, to know when to smile and when to disappear before trouble arrived. Raph listened to all of it. He didn't interrupt. He didn't judge. He didn't pity her. And when she stopped, he only said, Go on, in a voice so soft she almost missed it. Breakfast lasted more than an hour. The longest breakfast since Raph had arrived at Ashworth House. That afternoon, in the library, Brianna was reading aloud to Cordelia as she did every day. Cordelia sat in the large armchair, eyes closed, head tilted, breathing evenly. Asleep, or pretending to be asleep. Brianna suspected she was pretending, because her breathing wasn't as steady as it was in real sleep, slightly faster, the rhythm of someone listening while feigning rest. She kept reading, her voice low and even. Then the library door opened. Raph stepped inside. I need my grandfather's journal, he said, looking toward the shelf behind Brianna. 3rd shelf down. She set the book she had been reading aside, stood, and walked to the shelf. Raph moved there too, from the opposite direction. The bookshelf was tall, packed close with books, the light in the library warm and golden. She reached up to the 3rd shelf. He reached too, the same shelf, the same place. Her fingers brushed his. Both of them went still. Brianna felt the warmth of his skin pass into hers, faint, but so clear she could hear her own heartbeat in her ears. She didn't pull her hand away. He didn't pull his away. 3 seconds passed. 3 seconds as long as 3 minutes. Then Raf spoke, his voice low, nearly a whisper, only enough for her to hear. "You make me lose control. I'm not used to that." Brianna swallowed. Her heart was beating in her throat. "Neither am I," she whispered back. Their fingers were still touching on the spine of the old book. Neither of them moved. The air in the library thickened, warm and heavy, carrying something both of them recognized and neither of them dared to name. In the armchair behind them, Cordelia Malone opened one eye, looked at the two of them standing by the shelf with their fingers touching in the late afternoon light. Then she closed her eye again and smiled. That night, after dinner, Brianna didn't go upstairs right away. She stepped out onto the back veranda of Ashworth House, where the wooden roof extended over a row of stone benches facing the southern garden. The October air was just cold enough to make her shiver slightly, but she didn't go back inside. She needed space. She needed to breathe somewhere without walls around her, without cameras, without his flinty gaze tracking her every movement. She sat on the stone bench, pulled her cardigan closer around her shoulders, and looked at the thin crescent moon, sharp as a cut across the sky. Footsteps sounded on the wooden floor of the veranda. She didn't turn around. She knew who was coming before he sat down beside her, because Raf's footsteps were different from everyone else's in that house. Steady, certain, the space between each step exactly the same, the footsteps of a man who controlled everything, even the way he walked. He sat at a distance that was just enough. Not too close, not too far. The silence stretched between them, but it wasn't heavy. It was the kind of silence shared by two people who didn't need words to know the other was there. Brianna kept her eyes on the moon. Then she asked softly, without looking at him. The photograph on Cordelia's desk. The young man standing beside the old car. "Was that your father?" She felt him go still beside her. Not much, only for a beat, as if his body had raised its defenses before he had time to decide whether it needed to. Silence. Long enough that Brianna thought he wouldn't answer, and she had already prepared herself to turn to another subject. Then he spoke. Declan Malone. His voice was even. His face remained turned toward the garden, not toward her. "My father. That photograph was taken when he was 25, a year before I was born." He stopped. Brianna said nothing, didn't ask more, didn't press. She had learned from the shelters that when someone is deciding whether to open a door, the worst thing you can do is knock. "He was shot when I was 8, Raf said. His voice stayed even, stayed controlled, like he was reading from a report. "In the kitchen, in our house in Red Hook, Brooklyn. Sunday morning. He was making coffee." He stopped again, swallowed. Brianna saw his throat move in the dark. "The floor was white tile," he said. "The kitchen had white tile. My mother liked white tile because it made the room bright, and I was standing in the kitchen doorway, watching the coffee spill across the floor and mix with my father's blood on the white tile, spreading out, slow, little by little, and I remember thinking it looked like a map, like the maps my father used to spread over the dining table every evening, showing me where the docks were, where our territory was, where the lines were that no one was allowed to cross." He told it in that same even voice. His eyes looked straight into the darkness ahead, not at her, not at anything, or maybe at something only he could still see. That kitchen 28 years ago, the white tile, the coffee and blood, the 8-year-old boy standing in the doorway. 2 men walked out through the back door. Caruso men. I didn't know their names then. I only knew they stepped over my father without looking down. Like he wasn't there, like he was part of the floor. Raf stopped. The silence stretched again. The wind stirred the branches in the garden, leaves whispering softly. "I didn't cry," he said. "Not because I was strong, because I decided in that moment that crying was what made people look down at you, and I was never going to let anyone look down at me again." Brianna sat still, listening. Every word he spoke fell into her like stones dropping into a deep well, sinking and sinking without ever reaching the bottom. She didn't say, "I understand," because she knew she didn't, not completely. She had lost her parents at 16, old enough to remember everything, but also old enough to force herself back to her feet. He had lost his father at 8, seen it with his own eyes, on a white-tiled floor, and had taught himself to stop crying all in the same morning. Those were two different kinds of loss. She wouldn't dare compare them, but she knew one thing. Raf's hand, resting on his thigh, was trembling, slightly, almost too faint to notice. But Brianna noticed everything, and she knew, after 5 days of watching him, that Rafferty Malone's hands never trembled. Those hands removed gloves with perfect precision. Those hands gave Oscar the nod to act without a flicker of hesitation. Those hands signed orders, held whiskey glasses, controlled the entire underworld of the Northeast. Those hands didn't shake. But now, on the back veranda of Ashworth House, beneath the thin October moon, those hands were trembling, because he had just told her something he had perhaps never told anyone in 28 years. Brianna didn't say a word. She didn't need to. She only reached out slowly, gently, and placed her hand over his. He stopped trembling, for a second. Then he turned his hand over, palm up, and took hers. Tight, his fingers closed around hers, hard, almost painfully, as if she were the only thing keeping him from falling, as if letting go would make her vanish and leave him once again alone on that white tiled floor. They sat there without speaking, hand in hand, the crescent moon thin above them, the wind cold, but neither of them went inside, and Brianna understood, with something deeper than reason, that she wasn't staying because he was strong. She was staying because he was broken too. They sat like that long enough for Brianna to lose all sense of time. His hand was still holding hers, tight but no longer painful, only warm and steady now, like a man who had finally found an anchor and didn't want to let go. The October wind moved across the veranda, carrying the scent of wet maple leaves and cold earth. The crescent moon shifted slowly across the sky. Neither of them spoke for many minutes. Then Raf broke the silence. "I don't want you to leave when the week is over." His voice was low, a little rough, as if the words had been lodged in his throat for a long time and had finally found their own way out. Brianna didn't turn to him right away. She looked out at the dark garden in front of them, where the shadows of the trees had blended into the night until they became one solid mass of black. Her heartbeat slowed, then sped up again, uneven, losing its rhythm, like a heart trying to remember how to beat after hearing the very thing it had longed to hear. "Because of the arrangement, or because of something else?" she asked, her voice softer than she had meant it to be. Raf turned to look at her. In the darkness, his gray eyes looked different, not cold, not sharp, but deep, open, carrying something Brianna had never seen in him before, truth with no armor wrapped around it. "What do you think?" he asked in return. Brianna knew the answer. She knew it from the way he had poured her tea exactly the way she liked it that morning, without asking, from the way he had said, "Go on," when she spoke about her past, from the way his hand had trembled when he told her about the white-tiled floor, and the way he had held on to her as if afraid of losing the one thing keeping him from sinking. She knew. But knowing and hearing weren't the same thing. She turned to look at him. Close. Closer than she had realized. His face was only inches from hers, the moonlight tracing the line of his nose and the hard edge of his jaw. His eyes were on her, waiting, not pressing, not demanding, only waiting. Then he leaned down, slowly, giving her time, giving her room to pull away if she wanted. If she turned her face, if she stood up, if she said no, he would stop. Brianna knew that as surely as she knew her own name, because Rafferty Malone controlled everything, and that included never taking what another person wasn't willing to give. She didn't pull away. She closed her eyes. His mouth touched hers, softly, so softly that for a moment Brianna wasn't even certain it was real, like a butterfly landing and lifting away, like a dream brushing against consciousness before fading. He paused there, his lips against hers, his breath warm on her skin, giving her one final moment to choose. She chose. She lifted her hand and placed it against his chest, where she could feel his heart beating beneath her palm. Fast and hard, the complete opposite of the calm exterior he always wore. And the kiss deepened, slowly, surely. His mouth was warmer and softer than she had imagined. And she had imagined it, more than she wanted to admit. In the nights, she lay awake in the attic, staring at the ceiling. His hand left hers and moved up her arm, over her shoulder, then stopped at the back of her neck, his fingers slipping gently into her hair, holding her without trapping her. The kiss tasted of restraint finally surrendered, of two people who had tried to keep their distance for 5 days, and were now admitting that distance had never truly existed at all. When they parted, His forehead rested against hers. Both of them were breathing harder than before. Brianna opened her eyes. His were already open, looking at her, close enough that she could see herself reflected in the gray. "I'm still afraid of your world," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly at the end. Raf didn't pull back. His forehead remained against hers. His hand remained at the back of her neck. "I know," he whispered back. Then, softer still, almost soundless, "I'm afraid too." Those 3 words fell between them like the last shard of glass from the wall he had spent 28 years building. For the first time in his life, Rafferty Malone admitted fear to someone, and that someone was the girl who had once slept holding her shoes in Hunts Point. They stayed on the veranda a while longer after that, hand in hand, saying nothing more. The words already spoken were enough. But the next morning, the world they both feared came knocking at Ashworth House in a line of white cars trimmed in silver, and a smile sharp as a blade. Brianna woke on the morning of the 6th day, with the feeling that her lips were still warm. She lay still for a few seconds, staring at the sloped attic ceiling, her fingertips brushing her lower lip. Last night had been real. The kiss had been real. His hand in her hair had been real. The words "I'm afraid too" had been real. She allowed herself to hold on to that feeling for 3 seconds more. Then she got up, washed her face, braided her hair, put on a simple dress, and went downstairs. Because in this house, 3 seconds was all the luxury reality allowed. She knew that the moment she looked out the second-floor hallway window. Down in the front drive, beside Raf's familiar line of black vehicles, there were 2 new SUVs, white, silver-trimmed, out-of-state plates. She hadn't even had time to think before Cordelia's voice rang out from the sitting room on the first floor, clear, sharp, carrying something close to irritation held in check by decades of practice. "I didn't invite them." Brianna hurried down the stairs. Cordelia was standing beside the window in the sitting room, leaning on her cane, standing with regal poise, her eyes fixed on the front drive. Raf stood in the middle of the room, phone in hand, his jaw tight. Oscar was by the door, one hand resting near his side. "The Davenport family," Raf said, his voice flat. "Don Aurelio and his daughter." The great doors of Ashworth House opened. Brianna stood behind Cordelia, the position she knew well, the place of the caretaker, invisible, at the edge of the room. But today she didn't feel invisible. She felt exposed. Don Aurelio Davenport entered first, 60 years old, silver hair combed smooth, a pale gray suit cut to perfection, the broad smile of a man accustomed to being welcomed everywhere he went. He shook Raf's hand, embraced Cordelia with a familiarity Brianna recognized at once as false, because his eyes didn't smile with his mouth. Then Priscilla Davenport stepped in behind her father, and Brianna understood immediately why this world considered Priscilla the perfect choice for Rafferty Malone. She was beautiful. Not ordinarily beautiful, beautiful in a way that looked designed. Soft blonde curls spilling over her shoulders, flawless skin, a designer dress fitted close to her body that Brianna estimated cost more than 6 months of her old wages. Her smile was wide, white, perfect. Everything about Priscilla Davenport was perfect, and Brianna, standing there in the simple dress Cordelia had given her, her hair plainly braided, no jewelry, no lipstick, felt that perfection like a slap. But she didn't study Priscilla's clothes or face for long. She looked at the eyes, and those eyes told her everything she needed to know. They moved. Fast, precise, systematic. They swept across the sitting room in less than 3 seconds, taking note of Oscar's position, the camera in the corner of the ceiling, the distance from the front door to the back. Then they stopped on Brianna, assessed, categorized, dismissed, all in a single glance. Brianna recognized it instantly because she had seen that kind of look before, on the face of the Caruso spy pretending to be a wine supplier. The same kind. Calculating, searching for weakness, building a map. Priscilla stepped toward Cordelia, kissed her cheek, her voice sweet as honey. Then she turned to Brianna. "And this must be Cordelia's caretaker I've heard about?" She smiled. That smile was sweet as sugar, and Brianna knew sugar could be mixed with glass. How lovely. 2 words, gentle, harmless to anyone who didn't know how to listen. But Brianna had spent 11 years surviving by hearing what people didn't say, and she heard what lay beneath those 2 words, contempt wrapped in politeness, the same kind she had heard in Raf's debt runs in the blood that first night. Only Priscilla hid her blade with lipstick instead of a suit. Throughout the morning, while Priscilla sat drinking tea with Cordelia and Don Aurelio talked business with Raph in the study, Brianna watched. She saw Priscilla take out her phone 4 times. Each time, she angled the screen away from everyone's line of sight, tilted about 45 degrees, just enough to keep anyone from reading the display. Once might have been habit. 4 times was intention. Brianna noticed, said nothing. Before lunch, when the group was standing in the main hall, Priscilla approached her. She stood close, closer than politeness allowed, her smile still perfect. "I hear Cordelia's grandson has been spending rather more time with the caretaker than usual," Priscilla said, her voice low enough for only the 2 of them to hear. "I hope you haven't mistaken courtesy for something else." Priscilla's eyes held Brianna's. The smile was gone now. Only steel remained. Brianna didn't answer, not because she was afraid. Because she was busy observing. She was putting the pieces together. The eyes that moved like a spy's. The phone angled away 4 times, the knowledge of something between her and Raph that Priscilla shouldn't have known if she had arrived only that morning. Brianna didn't answer, but she knew. Priscilla Davenport hadn't come to Ashworth House to compete for a man. She had come to wage war. Dinner was laid out on the longest oak table in Ashworth House. White candles stood in silver holders, porcelain plates rimmed in gold, crystal glasses arranged from largest to smallest, polished silverware set down at intervals measured to the millimeter. Cordelia had arranged it all with the precision of someone who understood that in this world, dinner wasn't a meal, but a battlefield, and the weapons were things like the way you placed a fork. Brianna sat at the far end of the table, the place for a caretaker, not a guest. She didn't object. She understood the rules of the game. Today she wasn't Rafferty Malone's lover. Today she was an employee, and the distance between those 2 identities was wider than the length of the table before her. Priscilla sat in the place of honor, at Raph's right. She had changed into a new dress for dinner, black, off the shoulder just enough to suggest without going too far, elegant in the way money alone can't buy, unless generations of training come with it. She smiled at the right moments, spoke about the right things, touched Raph's hand lightly, while telling an anecdote about a trip to Italy the previous summer. The gesture so natural it looked accidental. But nothing Priscilla Davenport did was accidental. Brianna knew that. She watched from the end of the table in silence, her plate of food barely touched, and counted. Priscilla touched Raph 3 times in 40 minutes. She leaned toward him 5 times. She said his name, Rafferty, in a low, intimate voice, each time letting the final syllable linger longer than necessary. Raph was courteous. He answered her, smiled the proper amount, wasn't rude, wasn't cold, but he was stiff. His body didn't angle toward Priscilla. His eyes didn't warm when he looked at her. And twice during dinner, his gaze flicked toward the far end of the table, where Brianna sat, fast, almost impossible to notice. But Brianna noticed. And Priscilla noticed too. The second time Raph looked toward Brianna, Priscilla was lifting her wineglass to her lips. She paused for half a second, her eyes following the direction of Raph's glance, to the end of the table, to Brianna. Then she drank. Her face didn't change, but Brianna saw her fingers tighten around the stem of the glass. Dinner ended. Everyone moved into the sitting room. Coffee. Cognac for Don Aurelio. Tea for Cordelia. Brianna stood near the fireplace, slightly back. The place she had stood for 3 years whenever guests were present. Close enough to serve, far enough to be invisible. But tonight she wasn't invisible. Priscilla walked toward her. Not an ordinary walk. A walk with intention. Slow, exact, like a cat moving toward prey it had already chosen. She stopped an arm's length away, the perfect smile still on her lips, but her eyes weren't smiling. Her eyes were cold, sharp, and carried something Brianna recognized at once, calculated cruelty. "I was curious, so I did a little research on you, Holloway." Priscilla's voice wasn't low. She wasn't whispering. She spoke loudly enough for the whole room to hear. Loud enough for Don Aurelio to turn his head. Loud enough for Cordelia to set down her teacup. Loud enough for Raph, standing by the window, to go still. "Quite interesting, really," Priscilla went on, her voice sweet as sugar, like a blade wrapped in velvet. "A shelter in the Bronx. Hunts Point, wasn't it? Then a late-night bar in Brooklyn, serving drinks to drunken men until 2 a.m, then cleaning motel rooms in Jersey City." She paused, looked around the room, made sure everyone was listening. Everyone was listening. "And your uncle?" Priscilla said. Douglas Holloway owes $2.7 million. Ran, disappeared, left behind you, his only niece, in the very house of the man he owes. She tilted her head, looking at Brianna with that false pity Brianna had seen hundreds of times in her life. From shelter workers, from bar owners, from everyone who looked at her and saw something pitiable instead of something worthy of respect. You didn't come here because you love anyone, Priscilla concluded, her voice gentle, soft, cruel. You came here because there was nowhere else in this world willing to take you. The room went silent, not a sound. No glass against china. No breath that could be heard. Absolute silence. The kind that comes after an explosion, when everything has already shattered and the pieces haven't yet had time to hit the ground. Brianna stood beside the fireplace. Every eye in the room turned toward her. Cordelia was looking at her. Don Aurelio was looking at her. Raph was looking at her, his eyes dark, his jaw locked, his body drawn tight as a wire about to snap. And Priscilla was looking at her too, that perfect smile still in place, waiting for her to cry, waiting for her to run, waiting for her to break. The past Brianna had hidden for 3 years had just been ripped open in front of everyone. Every piece of it, the shelters, the late-night bar, the uncle drowning in debt, lay scattered across the sitting room of Ashworth House like dirty things dumped out in the middle of a formal dinner. She felt the ground give way beneath her feet. She felt the air pulled out of her lungs. She felt her eyes burn and her throat close. But she didn't fall. Brianna took a breath. Slow, deep. She felt the air move into her lungs, cold and heavy, and she held it there for 1 second before letting it out. 11 years. 11 years of surviving by not collapsing in front of people who were waiting for her to collapse. Shelter workers had looked at her with pity when they handed her a thin blanket. The bar owner had looked at her with contempt when she asked for an advance on her wages. Her uncle had looked at her with emptiness when he closed the door on the house her parents had left behind. She hadn't broken in front of any of them. She wouldn't break in front of Priscilla Davenport. She straightened. Her back left the fireplace. Her shoulders opened. Her eyes lifted. She looked directly into Priscilla's eyes. Everything you said is true. Brianna's voice didn't shake. It wasn't raised. It wasn't quiet. It was even clear, carrying through the silent sitting room like the sound of a bell. I lived in shelters. I served drinks in bars. I cleaned motel rooms. I survived a Hunts Point winter when people froze to death in the street. I lived through those things. She paused. 1 beat. But you, Brianna said, her voice unchanged. Not angry, not scornful, only truth placed beside truth. Could you survive even 1 day in any of it? The room went still. A different kind of silence from the one that had followed Priscilla's words. That silence had been shock. This one was respect. Or at the very least, astonishment. Priscilla opened her mouth, but no words came out. For the first time since entering Ashworth House, her perfect smile vanished, and what lay underneath flashed into view for half a second. Anger, helplessness, and fear. Fear, because she had just thrown the hardest blow she had, and the woman standing in front of her hadn't fallen. Don Aurelio set his cognac glass down on the table, slowly, his eyes on Brianna with an expression she couldn't read. Cordelia sat still, one hand resting on her cane, her eyes bright, not surprised, not worried, only satisfied, the way she was always satisfied when a truth she had seen long before anyone else was finally proven. Raph stood by the window, his jaw still tight, but his eyes had changed. The darkness that had gathered in them while Priscilla spoke was still there, but now it had mixed with something else, something hot, deep, fierce, something Brianna would never forget even if she lived another 100 years. Then the sitting room door opened. A servant stepped inside, face pale, eyes darting to Raph, then to Brianna, then back to Raph again, clearly unsure which of them he ought to address. "Sir," the servant said, his voice trembling as he looked at the tablet in his hand, "our scouts just tracked down Douglas Holloway. He was caught trying to board a bus in Newark. Oscar's men have brought him to the gate. He's begging for a chance to see his niece before he's dealt with." The room froze. Time stopped moving. Brianna heard that name and felt the floor tremble beneath her feet. Not literally, but that was how it felt. As if the house itself were trying to throw her out. Douglas, her uncle, the man who sold her parents' house, the man who signed away guardianship when she was 16, the man she hadn't seen in 11 years. The man Raph had been hunting. Here he was. Here. Raph looked at Brianna. His ash-colored eyes were sharp, reading her, searching her face for the answer to the question he didn't say aloud, but both of them understood. Which side would she choose? This was the real test. Not Cordelia measuring her, not Priscilla attacking her. Life itself, real life, crashing through the door and demanding that she choose, right now, in front of everyone. Brianna looked back at Raph. She didn't cry. She didn't run. She didn't lower her eyes. He abandoned me when I was 16, she said, her voice even, though Raph could hear it, and Brianna knew he could hear it. The pain beneath the calm, deep, old, never fully healed. He took everything my parents left behind. He threw me into the street. I haven't seen him in 11 years. I don't owe him anything. She paused, swallowed. But please don't kill him. The final words came softer, thinner, carrying something Brianna hated in herself for still being there. Mercy. Mercy for a man who didn't deserve it, but who was still blood, still her uncle, still the last broken fragment of family she had ever had. Raph looked at her for a long moment, then he nodded. Once. Slowly, Oscar stepped out of the room without needing a second instruction. Brianna heard his footsteps moving toward the front doors, heard the gate open, heard the voice of a man she no longer recognized because 11 years is long enough to forget a voice. Oscar brought Douglas into a private room in the West Wing. Not through the sitting room. Not where Brianna would have to look at his face tonight. Brianna remained standing in the middle of the room. Her past had just been laid bare for the second time in one night. First by Priscilla, then again by Douglas simply by appearing. Every piece of her life, orphaned girl, shelters, debtor's niece, had been spread open before everyone like a deck of cards turned face up. She had nothing left to hide, but she was still standing. And Raph looked at her from across the room with eyes Brianna had never seen on him before. The eyes of a man seeing something he hadn't known still existed in this world, and unable to look away. Raph moved. Not fast, not rushed. Slowly, steadily, with purpose, each step carrying the weight of a man who had made a decision and could no longer be turned from it by anything in this world. He walked from the window, past Don Aurelio, past Priscilla, until he came to Brianna's side. Then he stopped, and placed his hand against her back. Lightly, the warmth of his palm settled between her shoulder blades. He didn't pull her toward him. He didn't wrap an arm around her. He simply let his hand rest there. But in this world, in that room, in front of Don Aurelio Davenport, the Southern boss, that gesture was louder than any spoken declaration. She is mine. Don't touch her. Brianna felt the warmth of his hand through the thin fabric at her back. She didn't move, didn't lean into him, didn't step away. She only stood there, straight and still, and let his hand speak for both of them. Raph turned to Priscilla. His voice didn't rise. It didn't sharpen. It was low, even, perfectly courteous. And that courtesy made every word weigh 10 times more than a shout. Priscilla, you just insulted one of my people. In my house. The 4 words "one of my people" hung in the air. Priscilla went pale, not because she was afraid of Raph, or not only because of that, but because she understood at once, with the instinct of someone raised among mafia families, that those 4 words weren't a declaration of affection. They were a declaration of power, and she had just crossed that line. Don Aurelio rose from the armchair slowly and carefully, his eyes moving between Raph and Priscilla. He understood the situation faster than his daughter did. He opened his mouth, perhaps to apologize, perhaps to explain, perhaps to maneuver the moment into something salvageable. But he didn't get the chance to say a single word, because Oscar walked into the sitting room. No knock, no request for permission. He entered, carrying a tablet in his left hand, his face as expressionless as concrete. He went straight to Raph, handed him the tablet. Raph looked at the screen, silent. 2 seconds. 3. Then he lifted his head, looked at Priscilla, and Brianna saw something in his eyes she hoped she would never see directed at herself. Cold, empty, the same eyes she had seen through the cracked door in the East Wing on the night the spy was interrogated. Oscar, Raph said, his voice smooth as the surface of a lake before a storm. Explain to Don Aurelio how our security perimeter was breached. Oscar took the tablet, turning the screen toward Don Aurelio. Our signal interceptors flagged an unauthorized device within these walls. We've been monitoring Miss Davenport's outgoing data since she arrived. In the last 24 hours, our system intercepted 17 encrypted messages sent to an anonymous number. The contents were decoded: GPS coordinates of Ashworth House, guard schedules, and detailed floor plans. Oscar paused. The anonymous number was traced to a device registered in Newark, New Jersey, Caruso territory. The room fell silent for the third time that night. But this silence tasted different. Not shock, not respect, danger. The kind of silence that comes just before a gunshot. Don Aurelio looked at Priscilla. His face had gone white. "Priscilla," he said, and for the first time Brianna heard his voice tremble. "What did you do?" Priscilla didn't answer her father. She looked at Raph. Her mouth opened, but no words came. The perfect smile was gone for good. What remained on her face was naked fear, real fear, stripped of disguise, the fear of someone who had just realized the game was over, and she was standing on the losing side of it. The marriage between Raph and Priscilla had never been an alliance. It had been a trap. The Davenport family had been selling Raph to Caruso in exchange for something Brianna didn't know, and didn't need to know. Cordelia rose to her feet. Slowly, her cane struck the floor once, sharp and neat. She looked at Don Aurelio with the same black eyes Brianna had once seen turned toward the late afternoon garden, calm, distant, and absolutely unforgiving. "Get out of my house," she said. "Now." Don Aurelio didn't argue. He took Priscilla by the hand and pulled her toward the door. Priscilla followed him, her steps unsteady, stripped of every ounce of perfection she had carried into Ashworth House that morning. As she passed Brianna, she paused for half a second, looked at her, and in Priscilla Davenport's eyes, Brianna didn't see hatred. She saw fear. Fear of the girl in the simple dress standing beside the mafia boss of the Northeast. The Davenport family left Ashworth House in the night. Engines started. Headlights swept across the grounds. Then they were gone into the dark. The sitting room slowly emptied. Cordelia returned to her room. Oscar vanished toward the west wing where Douglas was being held. The servants cleared the glasses. The candles burned low, wax spilling over silver holders. Brianna stood by the fireplace alone, looking at the fire as it died down. Every mask had fallen. Priscilla, Don Aurelio, Douglas, and her too. Her past, her pain, everything lay exposed on the floor of the sitting room at Ashworth House. There was nothing left to hide. That night, Brianna lay in bed with her eyes open, staring at the attic ceiling. She didn't think about Priscilla. She didn't think about Douglas. She thought about Raph's hand on her back. Warm, steady. One of my people. But why? Because of the arrangement? Because of the will? Because she had saved him from a spy? Because she was a useful piece on the board? She didn't know. And she knew that if she stayed without knowing, if she stayed only because the debt had been erased and the contract was signed, then this love would be poisoned by circumstance. She needed to be chosen, truly chosen, not because of the will, not because she was convenient, because of her. Brianna left the sitting room when the last candle went out. She stepped into the first-floor hallway, where the darkness felt thicker than any night she could remember, with only a single lamp at the far end casting a pale gold wash across the wooden floor. She heard footsteps behind her, steady, certain, the distance between each step exactly the same. She didn't need to turn around. Brianna. The first time he had said her name without Miss Holloway in front of it. Just her name. 2 syllables. Soft. As if he had practiced saying it in his mind many times before finally letting it leave his mouth. She stopped, turned. Raph stood a few steps away, his jacket gone at some point, his shirt sleeves rolled up, looking more tired than she had ever seen him. Tired not from lack of sleep, tired because tonight had stripped away too many layers. Hers, Priscilla's, his own. And what remained underneath was more exposed and more vulnerable than anyone in that sitting room had guessed. "You know what I am," he said, not asked, said. His voice was low, rougher than usual, as though the words had been ground between his teeth before he let them out. "You've seen enough this week to understand my world. I won't blame you if you want to leave." Brianna looked at him. The hallway was dim, the yellow light falling at an angle across his face, sharpening the line of his jaw and the darkness beneath his eyes. He was offering her a door, open, unlocked. She could walk through it, go upstairs, pack her suitcase, and vanish from Ashworth House by morning as if she had never been there. He wouldn't stop her. She knew he wouldn't. "I saw the blood on your sleeve the other night," Brianna said. Her voice was even, but every word carried the weight of a truth she had measured carefully before speaking. "I heard the car leave at 3 in the morning. I know that in your world, Handling something doesn't mean calling the police. Silence. The hallway swallowed the sound of both their breathing. I heard what happened in the East Wing that night, she went on. I saw your eyes through the crack in the door. Empty. I heard your polite voice while Oscar did things I don't want to imagine. Raph didn't move, didn't defend himself, didn't explain. He stood there and took each word from her the way a man takes bullets, straight on, without flinching. And I'm still standing here, Brianna said. 4 words. Soft, but heavier than everything that had been said in the sitting room that night. Heavier than the way Priscilla had torn open her past. Heavier than Cordelia's order sending the Davenports out of the house. Heavier even than the words one of my people, Raph, had spoken in front of everyone. Because this was Brianna's truth, freely given, not forced, not because of a contract, not because of debt. She knew what he was. She was choosing to remain. Raph stepped toward her. 1 step, then another, until he stood directly in front of her, close enough for her to feel the warmth rising from his chest, to catch the scent of sandalwood mixed with gunpowder that no cologne could entirely hide. He lifted both hands and placed them on either side of her face, his thumbs brushing lightly over her cheeks. Then he bent and kissed her. Not gently like he had on the veranda, not hesitant, not leaving space to retreat. This was a different kiss. Strong, certain, carrying the taste of a declaration and a promise. The taste of a man who had nearly lost something and was now holding on with everything he had. Brianna kissed him back. Her hands caught in his shirt, pulling him closer, and in that moment the dark hallway, the smell of extinguished candles, the shadows of Ashworth House, all of it disappeared. When they pulled apart, Raph rested his forehead against hers. I'll deal with Douglas, he said softly. He'll live, but he'll disappear. Permanently. No money, no contact. He'll never come back. Brianna nodded. She didn't ask for details. She didn't need them. The debt is gone, Raph added. From now on, you don't owe anyone anything. The debt was closed. The chain that had dragged her into Ashworth House, the chain named Douglas Holloway, had been cut clean through. She was free. For the first time in 11 years, no one was holding her there through debt, through contract, through circumstance. Raph kissed her forehead, lightly, then turned and walked toward the West Wing. His footsteps faded into the distance. Brianna remained in the hallway alone, free, and because of that freedom, she understood more clearly than ever what she needed. She wouldn't stay because there was nowhere else to go. She wouldn't stay because of debt, or a will, or a contract, or because of the warmth of his hand against her back in front of a room full of people. She would make Rafferty Malone prove that she was worth choosing for herself, and not because of circumstance. Or she would leave. Brianna woke at 4 a.m. on the 7th day. No alarm clock. Her body had learned to wake before dawn back in the shelter days, when sleeping too long meant losing breakfast or worse. She lay still for a few seconds, looking at the attic ceiling one last time, the empty drill hole where the camera had once been mounted, the small crack above her that she had stared at every night for 3 years, the scent of old wood and books she had come to call home, longer than any place since her parents died. She rose, opened the wardrobe, took out the suitcase, the only suitcase she owned, old, the fabric faded, the left zipper catching a little, the same suitcase she had carried into Ashworth House 3 years earlier, and never unpacked again because she had nowhere else to go. She packed. There wasn't much, a few simple dresses, 2 books Cordelia had allowed her to keep, the knitted cardigan she had bought with her first month's wages, the dark blue dress Cordelia had given her. She folded that one most carefully and placed it on top, then changed her mind, took it back out, and laid it on the bed. That dress belonged to this house. It didn't belong in the suitcase. She sat at the small desk by the window, took paper and a pen from the drawer, Cordelia's stationery, the thick, cream-edged paper she had used to write hundreds of letters from Cordelia's dictation over the years. Today she wrote for herself. The first letter was for Cordelia. Her handwriting was neat and steady, though her hands wanted to shake. Cordelia, I don't know how to thank you enough. You gave me a roof when no one else in the world would. You saw me when I had grown used to being invisible. You trusted me enough to keep me here, and I won't ever forget that. But I have to go. Not because I don't want to stay. Because I need to know that if I stay, it's a choice, not desperation. Thank you. For everything. She folded the letter and placed it on the pillow. Then she took the second sheet of paper. This letter was harder. Every word she wrote carried weight. Every word hurt. Every word came with something she had to cut out of her own chest. Rafferty. I'm not leaving because I don't love you. I'm leaving because I have lived my whole life by contracts. The shelter gave me a bed because the system required it. The bar gave me wages because it needed a waitress. Ashworth House gave me a roof because Cordelia needed a caretaker. Every place I have ever stayed came with a condition, a contract, a reason that wasn't me. This time, I want to be chosen for real. Not because a will requires a wife, not because I'm convenient, not because I have nowhere else to go, because of me. If you can't give me that, I respect you enough to leave. She didn't sign it. He would know who had written it. She folded the letter, went downstairs in the dark, and placed it on the desk in his study, the place she knew he would sit first every morning. Then she went back up, took her suitcase, and came down the stairs again. The first-floor hallway was dark and silent. Ashworth House was asleep, but when Brianna reached the end of the hall, near the door leading into the main foyer, she saw a figure. Cordelia, standing in the doorway of her room, in a black silk robe, one hand resting on her cane, black eyes bright in the dark. She looked at the suitcase, looked at Brianna, not surprised. You're really leaving? She asked softly. I have to go, Cordelia. I know. She was silent for a moment. You're braver than I thought. Then she added, more gently, give him a chance. Brianna looked at her, a 75-year-old woman standing in the dark, her back straight, her eyes bright, powerful enough to terrify, and tender enough to love in the very same moment. If he wants me to stay, Brianna said, he has to come himself. Cordelia looked at her for a long moment. Then she smiled, sad, proud, and carrying something very close to hope. Brianna bowed her head to her. Then she turned away, stepped out through the great doors, crossed the grounds, and walked along the gravel path she had taken every day for 3 years. The iron gate of Ashworth House was already open. The night guard had unlocked it at her request over the attic intercom. She stepped outside the gate, stopped. Morning mist lay over the field ahead, white and shapeless, and the world beyond Ashworth House looked like a dream that hadn't yet taken form. Cold. Still. She set her suitcase down on the ground, took out her phone, called a taxi. Then she stood there beside the iron gate, the old suitcase by her feet, damp mist settling into her hair, and waited. Waited for the taxi that would take her away from the only place she had ever called home, and waited to see whether Rafferty Malone would come. Raff walked into his study at 5:15 in the morning, as he did every day, coffee on the desk, laptop open. But today, before he sat down, his eyes found the sheet of paper, folded in half, placed neatly in the center of the desk. Cordelia's stationery. The thick, cream-edged paper he recognized at once. But the handwriting wasn't Cordelia's. It was neat, steady, slanting slightly to the right. The handwriting he had seen on hundreds of letters Brianna had written while Cordelia dictated. He opened it, read, slowly, every word, then read it again. From the beginning, even more slowly. His eyes stopped at the line, I'm not leaving because I don't love you. And for a few seconds he couldn't go any farther. Then they stopped at, this time, I want to be chosen for real. Then at, I respect you enough to leave. He set the letter down, looked at it lying there on the oak desk. Then he did something no one had ever seen Rafferty Malone do. He stood up and ran. He didn't take the jacket hanging on the hook behind the door. He didn't straighten his tie. He didn't smooth his hair. He didn't call for Oscar. He ran through the hallway, through the great foyer, out the open front doors, across the grounds, over the gravel drive, toward the gate. The cold morning mist struck his face. His shirt was still wrinkled from the night before, his sleeves rolled up, his uncombed hair falling over his forehead. For the first time in his life, Rafferty Malone wasn't controlling the image he presented to the world. And he didn't care. Brianna stood outside the iron gate, the old suitcase at her feet, her hair damp with mist, her pale blue eyes fixed on the road leading away from the estate, where the taxi had not yet arrived. She heard the gravel crackle beneath fast footsteps, turned, and saw him. Not the gentleman, not the mafia boss of the Northeast. No suit, no tie, hair disheveled, gray eyes wide, startled, stripped bare in a way she had never seen before. He looked like a man who had just lost something and was running to reclaim it before it was too late. Raff stopped a few steps from her, breathing hard. His breath rose in thin clouds in the cold air. He looked at her, looked at the suitcase, looked back at her. "I called my lawyer," he said. His voice was rough, urgent, unpolished, uncontrolled. Nothing like the voice of Rafferty Malone she had come to know. "This morning, before I read your letter, I canceled the clause in the will. All of it. The holdings, the shares, the real estate. I'll let it all go to Caruso if that's what happens." Brianna shook her head. "You can't." "I already did," he cut in. "Douglas's debt. Erased. Oscar has copies of the documents. From this moment on, there's no will, no contract, no debt, no reason for you to stay." He stopped, swallowed. Except one. The mist thinned slowly around them. The first light of morning touched the tops of the maples by the road, pale gold and fragile. Raff stood straight. He didn't kneel. He was Rafferty Malone. He didn't kneel before anyone. But today he stood before her with every layer of armor stripped away, every wall lowered, every point of control surrendered, and that was braver than any kneeling could have been. "I love you," he said. "Not because my grandmother arranged it, not because you saved my life the night of the spy, not because you're convenient, or because I need a wife for a will." He stepped closer. One step. "I love you because you're the only person in this world who looked at me, saw the blood on my sleeve, heard the car at 3 a.m, knew what I am, knew what I've done, and still chose to stay." His voice broke on the final word, slightly, almost too softly to hear. But Brianna heard it. She heard everything. "Will you stay?" he asked. "Not because of a contract. Not because of debt. For me." Brianna looked at him. The man standing before her in the morning mist, shirt wrinkled, hair tousled, his eyes no longer cold, no longer empty, but open, alive, trembling, beautiful in a way she would remember until her final breath. And tears came, slipping down her cheeks, warm and slow. For the first time in 11 years, Brianna Holloway cried not because of pain, not because of loss, not because of fear, but because for the first time, someone had burned away every reason to keep her, only so she could be free to choose. "Yes," she whispered. Raff stepped forward and pulled her into his arms, both arms wrapped around her tight, hard. His face lowered into her hair, and she felt his whole body shaking the way it had on the night he told her about the white-tiled floor, only this time not from pain, but from relief, dizzying relief, like a man finally setting down something he had carried his entire life. He kissed her there in the morning mist, beside the iron gate where 7 days earlier the line of black SUVs had rolled in and everything had begun. They walked back into Ashworth House, hand in hand, their steps soft on the dew-wet gravel. The great doors opened, and in the sitting room, Cordelia Malone was already seated in her black velvet chair. On the low table before her sat 3 cups of tea already poured. 3 cups, not 2. She looked at the 2 of them as they entered, her black eyes bright, not surprised. Raff sat down beside her and took her hand. "You win," he said. Cordelia shook her head, smiled, and for the first time, Brianna saw her eyes shining with unshed tears. "This time," she said, her voice gentler than it had ever been, "all 3 of us win." The iron gates of Ashworth House closed. Brianna stood by the window in the reading room, the very place where she had been sitting when Cordelia's phone vibrated 7 days earlier, in another life. Raff came up behind her and placed a hand at her waist, light, warm, certain. Outside, the fields brightened under the morning sun, the mist lifting, the world coming clear. And for the first time, Brianna wasn't afraid of anything beyond the gates, because she knew she belonged on the inside. Not because anyone was keeping her there, because she chose to stay. Brianna and Raff's story is a story about choice, about how the true value of love doesn't live in someone holding on to you, but in their willingness to let go so you can be free, and you're choosing to come back anyway. About how the past doesn't define you, no matter how hard the world tries to use it to judge you. About how courage isn't the absence of fear, but being afraid and standing tall anyway. In real life, every one of us carries private wounds, long nights, betrayals, and those moments when it feels as though no one sees us anymore. But like Brianna, it only takes one person truly looking at you, not past you, not down at you, but into you, for everything to begin changing. If this story touched you, please press the like button to support our channel, and share this video with the people you love so they can hear it too. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you won't miss our new stories each day. We'd truly love to know how this story made you feel. Have you ever gone through a moment when you had to choose between safety and real love? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We're always listening from the deepest place in the human heart. We wish all of you watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace in every day ahead. Thank you for being here with us. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.